I will begin by introducing myself. My name is Patience Malaba, and I work as a Director of Government Relations and Policy at the Housing Development Consortium of Seattle, King County. And for this session, we will be talking about equitable transit-oriented development, specifically affordable and equitable transit-oriented development. And I am excited to be joined by a leader in the field, James Madden, who leads the Enterprise Community Partners Pacific Northwest work. So with that, I will go right into giving you an overview of where we are going to be focused on and what you'll be hearing later on from James. But before beginning this session, we would like to begin by acknowledging that we are all, wherever we are, on the unceded ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We cannot, particularly ourselves as HDC and our members, fulfill our mission and our vision of an anti-racist present if we don't first acknowledge and recognize the true history and the cost of colonization. Having said that, for this part of the session, I will take you through the history of racialized housing systems, and I'm pretty sure many of you have been in this field and talk about these specific pieces of information every day, but it's always important that we ground these conversations on this history and recognize that these systems continue to exist through this current century that we are in. So we'll look at the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st century. And I'll talk a little bit about the diverse community typologies that we're seeing now in the current 21st century and cover a little bit on the principles of ETOD. And James will go further into the two specific typologies and examples of projects where we have seen ETOD principles being grounded in development, particularly working with BIPOC communities. So I want to begin by just also telling you about who the Housing Development Consortium is. We are an association of the affordable housing community. We work in Seattle, King County, across jurisdictions in the region. And our vision is really to ensure that all people, and by all people, I mean all people, live in safe, healthy, and affordable homes within communities of opportunity. And we do this grounded on equity, recognizing that collaboration is where the effective solutions are. So diving right into the 19th century, beginning with the 1800s. As I began this meeting, I did acknowledge that we are on the Coast Salish people's land. This was the land that they had been for thousands of years. And in 1851, we see the first white settlers arrive. As they arrive a few years later, they sign the Point Elliott Treaty, which was the first point of systemic infrastructure set to displace Native people from their own land. And in 1865, in what was to become our region, we also see the incorporation of the city of Seattle. And within this incorporation, I will talk briefly about Ordinance 5, which was that infrastructure of displacement of the first communities of color that they had found here on this land. And later on in 1869 was what set the current Seattle government establishment. And this is not just particular to Seattle, this history can really be applied to a vast amount of our region and our state. So what we saw with Ordinance 5 was a displacement of the people who had owned this land and had lived in this land, where you will see that the language was to say that be it ordained by that board of trustees, which by the way, was later dissolved at that time because of some of the dissatisfaction by their own community. And it said that be it ordained by the Board of Trustees of the town of Seattle that no Indian or Indians shall be permitted to reside or locate their residence on any street, highway, lane, or alley, or any vacant lot in the town of Seattle. So this was the beginning of one community being excluded. And we continue to see this pattern in all other communities of color. And briefly, I will go into talking about what we saw happen with African-American people here in Seattle. In the 1860s, we see the first African-American resident move here, and we saw William Cross being the second person who moved to Seattle. And when he arrives in Seattle after being convinced by the then governor of the Washington State Legislature, he moved here and was able to purchase 12 acres of land from Henry Yesler in what is now Central District. And in that place, he was able to develop a hotel and also own a restaurant that gave people jobs and economic opportunities, and they were able to thrive in that community. Later on, that is followed by redlining that we see through the HLOC and the continuous disinvestment going into where we are now, where we have less than 8% of the population in the Central District being people of color. So there is this history and compounding effect that continues and that we see. And one thing that I'll particularly speak to is that during this era, from the 1860s towards 70s to 1930, we were really in a region where transportation was driving a lot of the planning and the development. Most of the developments were around transit infrastructure. And just to spend a few more minutes talking about the history of exclusion, we also saw the exclusion of the Chinese people, another group of the Black, Indigenous, and people of color community who were being impacted from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to the point where they were immigrating here after they had been working in the railroad system. But the labor unions were putting pressure at the time, and this is not to attack labor unions, to say that at the point when the railroads had felt that the Chinese people had worked for so long with them and they were no longer at a point where they needed a lot of these communities, they were at a point where they accepted and supported the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And in 1886, we see an anti-Chinese riots in Seattle in particular. So we continue to see this displacement and pushing out of communities of color that is deep-seated in existing systems now. And that's why it's important that as we go forward in thinking of transit-oriented development, we are thinking of these historic contexts that have set our system to work in the way that they do. Moving right into the 20th century, this is where we see a new wave of the use of zoning as a tool. And I particularly extracted this first residence ordinance that Harlan Bartholomew worked on in Seattle. And Harlan Bartholomew believed that zoning was a tool to make sure that colored people were not able to access first residences, which were fine residences where only white elite people would be expected to live. He was the one who drafted this and ensured that a lot of the land was being dedicated largely to single family dwelling. And there was a lot of reduction of denser housing as a result of the adoption of this zoning law. And this continues later on to become an economic exclusion because economic level or household income in many cases is a proxy for what becomes or was historically a racial intent. And as I mentioned earlier, from that point on with that zoning, we also see the redlining, which was done under the New Deal, as was offered under the Home Ownership Loans Corporation, with these areas being mapped exclusively for specific loan access. And the areas that were marked as undesirable, hazardous, continue to be the areas where we see people of color being able to access, but also where we've seen a lot of the gentrification that has happened over the years. And continuing with that line of exclusion, we also see the Japanese internments in the 1940s, from 1942 to 1946. And this is a picture of a youth in an internment camp here in Puyallup, where they were removed from Seattle to camp in the area called Camp Harmony in Puyallup. There was a significant loss of property and community ties, and the people who were being placed in this camp were being limited to a very small square footage area. And there's a specific code at this point that bans people being allowed to live in a less than 70 square feet space. And continuing on that trend, we go into the 1930s, where we are seeing this New Deal after the First World War, with the New Deal bringing on FHA loans that supported white flight and enabled middle-class white households to be able to move and buy into suburban areas. If you look at this time to the point where the GI Bill came online in 1948 with almost $200 billion that was invested, only 2% of that revenue was dedicated to people of color. So we're seeing this investments that is going into these communities with very limited benefit going towards communities of color. And we had the largest group of middle-class families being created in that era with very small benefits that accrued to communities of color. And be reminded that with the FHA loans, there was a requirement, or there was the use of transportation infrastructure as a division order to divide between the communities where largely African Americans lived and where the white households were placed in suburban areas. So transportation has been a key infrastructure that has played a big role in how our systems are being set and how people are being placed in community. And that's why it's important for us to continue to remind ourselves of where we've come from and why we should consider key principles in developing in such a way that we are inclusive and equitable in all ways. I pulled this one because it always blows my mind that in 1964, not too long ago, Seattle voted against an open housing ordinance which would remove the discriminatory nature of the racial covenants that had been inscribed in the housing title deeds. And with this, about 2-to-1 people voted against this measure. And of course, if you read a lot more into the history, later on, the council in 1968 voted this ordinance in place, but it had been voted against at the time for reasons that you all may know. And moving forward, this is not to say that our history has not seen some progression. In 1968, we do see some progression with the adoption of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, protecting against discrimination for protected classes. This, of course, did not mean that all of the historic and systemic discrimination of the people of color had ended at once. And that's why we later saw in the later years the affirmatively favoring fair housing rule that was adopted, which of course has also been gutted down by the Trump administration currently. And it is even more important for us to be advocating more strongly or working more intentionally with communities of color to further fair housing in a way that is coming from us as partners who recognize the importance of equity in our work. So I'm going to move real quick to the 21st century without spending a lot of time on any data, but just to give you a sense of what opportunities we see across the region, particularly with the work that we have seen PSRC do with Vision 2050, particularly for the 4 county areas that plan together under the Puget Sound Regional Council. We see that across the region, we have this vast TOD progression opportunities that are growing. We have a $60 billion opportunity that is coming to the Puget Sound region with the high capacity transit areas, and this includes some BRT opportunities as well, high capacity transit stations specifically. And that creates a vast opportunity of various communities where transit-oriented development can be built on. And what you realize is that it is not just in specific communities, but it's across the board. We have these opportunities where we can be leveraging this huge investment that is coming online in terms of transportation and aligning that with housing, particularly at this point where the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the housing need that we have. Therefore, the partnership with communities at this point becomes more critical. Another picture that shows you some of the TOD areas that we have across the region is right here, where we're seeing that it's not just here in the areas of Seattle and Bellevue, but it's across the board in South King County. As you will see that we also have regional growth centers across those areas. And we do have high capacity transit areas that can be leveraged on, that can be used as an area where we use to the maximum scale the land use capacity that those areas have. So having said that, in doing that work of leveraging these opportunities, I wanted to talk about some TOD principles that our HDC Transit-Oriented Development Task Force has talked about a little. We are working on developing ETOD principles, particularly to drive our work, but also borrowing from some of the work that communities of color have been doing for many years. The Puget Sound Sage has been doing a lot of this work in community visioning and planning in terms of how do we leverage these opportunities in transit infrastructure that are coming to us as a community. And the first principle is looking at how do we make sure that the existing residents benefit from TOD. And that simply means how do we support community-driven development? How do we make sure that as we come in place, we are supporting the existing residents, but we are also thinking of those who will be moving to the region to be able to thrive in that very community as well. And recognizing that community-driven development, in order for it to thrive, it's going to need various tools. And I'm going to move right into the affordable housing aspect here, where we know that in terms of funding tools that exist, we do not have sufficient financing tools. We do not have sufficient investors who will be able to support ETOD work. So it's important that we are innovative in creating those financing tools and making them available. There are areas in the country that have done it. As a region here, we are one region that's leading in that work, but how do we lead further in doing more in terms of making more financing tools available, expanding the Equitable Development Initiative work, for example, that Seattle has done, making that work region-wide is another critical component that we are standing here in support of and advocating for as we work in partnership with the county, and making sure that some of the resources that have been made available, like the Ready Fund that I'm sure James will unpack a little, can also be utilized to support some of this work across the region. And then of course, another aspect or critical principle is in creating quality jobs for people while they're in those areas, making sure that with these huge investments that are coming to our region, the economic benefits are accruing to those people who are in those communities, not just in terms of the placemaking or the infrastructure or buildings that are in place, but really we have jobs, we have amenities that are close by. We're able to take people out of their cars and create these communities where people are able to walk and thrive with greenhouse gas emissions very largely reduced in living in proximity to all these amenities that will be in place. And then of course, the other two last points that I want to reference is to talk about the importance of recognizing that racial equity outcomes are what is important, not just racial diversity goals. So this means that the work really has to be grounded in racial equity frameworks and in true partnership with these communities that are largely most impacted in many cases with transit infrastructure coming online. And then making sure that we are supporting and partnering with community serving institutions and businesses and making sure that they are stabilized, in particular as gentrification occurs, and preventing that gentrification from taking over and pushing communities or exiling communities from where they have been rooted in community with their fellow cultural institutions as well. So with that, I will pivot over to James, who will take us through some critical examples across the country and across the region that we can be referencing.
Thank you, Patience. Pull up my presentation. Thank you, everyone who has joined us today in what is certainly the oddest housing Washington we've had that most of us can remember. All right. So I'm going to continue where Patience left off in talking about equitable transit-oriented development. And you may notice the parentheses that we both put transit in, because transit is a piece of it, but it's really about building communities for people, where people can thrive, where they have what they need, and they aren't dependent on an automobile to get that. So we're going to talk a little bit of continuing the history. When I tell a story, I start at the very beginning. And I'll do two case studies, one that's a very dense urban typology and one that's a much more suburban typology, because we do, as Patience pointed out, have a broad diversity of communities that are getting transit investment and that have opportunity to do equitable development in them. And then once we finish the case studies, we'll suggest some questions for where our field's going to go locally. And first, a little bit about Enterprise. Enterprise Community Partners is a national nonprofit that supports housing and community development through a broad variety of means. Our mission is that everyone should have a safe, quality, affordable place to live, and that home should be a platform for them achieving what they want in their lives, whatever success, and that it's our job to help use the community development field as a platform for pursuing social and racial equity. I'm privileged to lead the Enterprise Community Partners Pacific Northwest office as of last month when M.A. Leonard retired. And we are focused on helping the community evolve to meet emerging challenges through creative capital, innovative programming, capacity building, and technical assistance and advocacy. So we should all be together in Tacoma today. So I thought I would start there and use the historic images of Tacoma just to remind us all that before we started building around automobiles, pretty much all development was transit-oriented development. We settled near rail lines, near streetcars, before that along omnibus pathways and so on. And you can really see that in these early images of Tacoma where the rail was so critically important, and you see people being near the trains and the port as they developed. The image to my right here shows what was some of the early Chinatown in Tacoma. Tacoma is where many of the Chinese rail workers who had dug tough tunnels through the Cascades and helped create these rail connections to our region settled after that job was done. And then from which, tragically, they were violently forced from their homes. A mob organized by the mayor of Tacoma gave a deadline for all Chinese to leave the city. They were escorted by men with horses and guns. And then after they were kicked out of Tacoma, these homes that you saw here and the rest of Chinese property and businesses were burnt to the ground. And that action in Tacoma actually resonates all the way across America to the location of the first case study I'm going to talk about, where many of the families who had been expelled from Tacoma eventually find their way to Boston, and they form some of the early community in Boston's Chinatown. And the site we're going to talk about is on Hudson Street in Boston's Chinatown, which for a couple generations was a vibrant neighborhood, children playing in the streets. There are all sorts of stories about multi-generational families looking out for each other and each other's children. And only 70 years after some of these families had experienced violent displacement from Tacoma, they saw half of their neighborhood torn down for a highway project, coincidentally for Interstate 90, which could take all the way back to the Puget Sound from Boston. One of the families that was displaced from Tacoma Their great-grandson grew up to become the legendary architect, planner, educator, Tunny Lee, who sadly passed away this July. Tunny did many things in his career. He's credited by many for saving Boston's Chinatown from further demolitions, from institutional expansion and other highway projects. And to our case study, one of the notable things he did was to help found the Asian CDC, which is one of several organizations in Boston's Chinatown that advocates for equitable development, and it is one of the premier CDCs in Massachusetts delivering on those promises. And I thought I would talk about Asian CDC's One Greenway project as an excellent example of a community-led vision that was realized in somewhat dramatic fashion to create a large mixed income, mixed tenure, mixed use, mixed finance development that was a long time in the making. And as in any development, had to compromise to get done, but kept the community in the lead the whole time. For its TOD, One Greenway is situated here at the corner of Neelid and Hudson, taking up that side of Hudson Street that I mentioned being demolished. And you can see a half mile in either direction. You have 3 different subway lines, commuter rail, Amtrak, intercity buses, and just outside this site, local buses. So really a true urban transit-oriented place where you shouldn't need a car and you can get anything you need. The vision called for a diversity of housing to be connected to the community, and ultimately they built 362 new homes, 40% of which were affordable. Some of the affordable were rentals, both to very, very low-income households and to working low-income households, as well as 50 affordable homeownership condominiums in a second phase. As most of you know, and some of you do for a living on this call, affordable homeownership can be incredibly challenging. They also made sure that the ground floor met the community, creating commercial and community space, much of it available at a discount to the community. They paid attention to the pedestrian connections and designing parks to help bring residents to the streets while transitioning between the public and private spaces. And parking always comes up as we talk about TOD. Seattle and much of our region is fairly progressive on parking. Boston is not. They did require it. There's not 135 spot underground parking garage open to both residents and the public. But as is important in TOD, it is very expensive, and you'll see it costs people $385 a month to keep a car near so much transit. And I think what's a great case study for us to learn from here in Washington from this development is the level of complexity and the level of partnership that it took. That doing a 3-phase high-rise was beyond Asian CDC's capacity as an organization, and they knew that as skilled developers as they were. And this was not their first joint venture. There's another great example of them partnering on a mixed income high-rise with a for-profit partner. And in this case, they chose the New Boston Fund, who are a for-profit developer who did both market rate and affordable. They were very sensitive to Asian CDC's needs, really let ACDC drive the conversation and saw their role as helping to realize that vision, which includes, again, hard compromises, but it got to a wonderful outcome that I think everyone on both sides was happy with. Wanted to point out the market rents. I don't have the current ones, but the 5 years ago rent when it leased up, I think is illustrative enough to give some context of just how expensive the neighborhood had become, that you need to be able to spend $36,000 a year or more on rent just to be able to get into a new unit in this neighborhood that for a century had been a home, more than a couple centuries had been home to immigrants and had really been a gateway to the city and a gateway to America. So the affordable housing piece of it is really critical. And you'll see the complexity that it took of 3 different tax credit programs: the federal low-income housing tax credit, Massachusetts has a state program. You can do that when you have a state income tax. Brownfield's tax credit program in the state. Wanted to call it the linkage payment. Boston requires linkages when you build either residential or office and allows them to be directed. And that linkage payment really helped unlock what was a pretty expensive affordable housing outcome there. And then a large slate of public subsidy gap filler to bring this to fruition. And it's a wonderful place now, well integrated into the community, and a huge contribution with a potential next phase on the way. The second case study I wanted to show was in a more suburban typology. And like I said, when I tell a story, I start at the beginning. And the beginning of this story literally starts when a rabbi, a priest, and a minister walk onto an urban renewal site that in the 60s, this neighborhood called Barry's Corner, which was a walkable, working class, mixed use neighborhood, was torn down. There were plans for hotels and office, but the rabbi, the priest, and the minister formed an ecumenical organization called Charles View Inc. and organized and won the site to be developed as affordable housing, which you see on the bottom here, developed in, as was the style of the time, poured concrete brutalism that was a good place to live for the people who lived there, met critical housing needs, but was highly disconnected from the neighborhood, from transit, from amenities. You can see the parking and the cars there. And the buildings aged poorly, especially for a lot of the vulnerable seniors who are living there. So 40 years later, Charles U. Inc. reached out to the community builders to partner with them on a redevelopment of the site. And what they eventually worked on together was to redevelop not in place on the original site, but to move about a half-mile away to redevelop what was then a vacant shopping center, but did have an active grocery store and was tighter to community and closer to some planned transit. And you can see here, and this is a condition we see in a lot of our suburban TOD settings, box stores, warehouse, huge surface parking lot, drive-through. Actually, it's a funny side story about this drive-through. It had to be replaced, and it's now maybe the most expensive McDonald's on the East Coast. I don't know. But the challenge was, how do we turn this into a people-oriented community, a transit-oriented community from this sort of home for cars? And in that design challenge, they use that condition to knit the community back together. You create walking pathways, certainly for the people who lived in the development, but also for the neighborhood that already existed to more comfortably reach the grocery store, to more comfortably reach the bus lines that were on the avenue, and the park that is by the river across here. So the development is working for itself and is equitable for the people living in it, but critically, it is also reconnecting the neighborhood. Not that most of the neighborhood saw it that way when these were just drawings on paper. Sadly, there were protests against this. They became fairly racially charged in nature, to the point where local elected officials, at the risk, some electoral risk, really stood up against some of the neighbors who were letting their prejudices try to prevent people from being able to live here, and really stood up for the development. And you can see in the end, we have a mixture of low density townhomes backing into the neighborhood, coming into a little bit higher density on the avenue into 5-story buildings. Oh, there was a point I wanted to make as well, the too much space for cars. So again, parking requirements. Underneath these 2 blocks, there is a 243 spot underground parking garage that was incredibly expensive. There's an additional 95 surface spots, either on the street or tucked behind some of the townhomes. Maybe half of that parking is used because this is a transit-oriented development. And there's a lesson in that of how much expense went into parking that ended up not even being necessary. And that is expense that could have gone into other things for the community. Ultimately, it was a 4-phase development, 240 rental units, predominantly low-income families, but also getting a little bit into higher income, some 6-figure income families called it home, and really families. I think nearly half of the development was 3 and 4 bedrooms. There's an affordable homeownership phase that was the first affordable homeownership post-recession in Massachusetts, a community retail phase, and a market condo phase that was one of the community demands, because they really did not want just low-income people living in this kind of suburban setting. It was done without any city subsidy or local public subsidy. It was a large 4% tax credit deal. The Section 8 contract is really what makes it work. It was one of the early developments to take advantage of HUD's 8BB, Section 8 HAP porting transfer, which if anyone wants to nerd out on, you can call me anytime to talk about that. But it allows you to move project-based subsidy from one site to another. And then that allowed this to leverage what was at the time the largest loan from the State Housing Finance Agency. And the only soft debt in this is a tiny bit of Priority Development Fund soft loan from the Housing Finance Agency. The sale of the old property was also very critical to making the rental phase come together. So fairly rich, but also done, again, in an environment where there was no city subsidy. The affordable homeownership phase was possible really because there was a significant rental phase. And again, this was done without direct public subsidy. There was some land donated by the ecumenical organization, which is valuable. The sales proceeds make up a bit of it, but what really made it possible was that the community builders reinvested their developer fee from the rental phase, which was sizable thanks to the size of the rental phase, to make this work. And it really made a model where TCB then went on in other projects and proposals to do this math. And if we get to a certain scale, we can provide some small amount of affordable homeownership in many cases. Similarly, the retail phase needed subsidy to make work. There was a windfall of brownfield tax credits that allowed the retail phase to really be community fronting. So there is now a bilingual early learning center on site. There's a family immigrant-run Afghani restaurant on site whose food I miss dearly. And then the market condos were done by a private developer, primarily with their equity. And I actually couldn't get the numbers in time for this morning. So sort of an interesting model for how you leverage scale to achieve a really diverse outcome and provide for a number of different communities together in what is a fairly suburban setting. And so with those two case studies from across the country kind of gone through, and hopefully there are some lessons there, I wanted to raise what are our future challenges in our region. And I like to say, and I really truly believe that our region is at the forefront of equitable transit-oriented development in America. Sound Transit has the most ambitious affordability target of any transit agency. We have great community groups across the region trying to realize these visions. So there's a lot that we're a leader in, which means that we can't always look to others for our next innovation and our next challenge. I think we can do that in some details, but we also need to challenge ourselves to think about what comes next. So a few questions I raise is, how does equitable transit-oriented development look in areas that have been historically exclusionary, that had those covenants, restrictive zoning, for example, in North Seattle or much of East King County? How does it look in areas where people of color have been living, as we see in Southeast Seattle, South King County, Tacoma? How do we pursue equity in both of those situations, and how do we tailor our approaches there? Capital availability is a big question. We have a tremendous amount of transit areas and sites that will be moving over the next 20 years, and we need to think hard about how we build those in concert with the transit expansion. Mixed income and joint venturing. This is one place where I think our region is not in the lead nationally, and it may or may not be desirable to pursue, certainly in all cases. But I think it's a tool that we could learn from it, and that's why I chose those two particular case studies, because they're pretty exemplary of what partnerships between larger developers and smaller community groups, market rate and affordable rental and homeownership can achieve. Equitable commercial spaces. We have to think about that. Communities who already live in a place typically aren't looking for new homes in that place. They live there. So often communities really care about what's at the ground floor. What businesses can they go to? What community spaces will there be? What open space will they have? And then finally, do we have the time? The two case studies that I showed were each about 12 years in the making. You'll notice both patients and I used images of El Centro de la Raza's Plaza Roberto Maestas. We didn't focus on the case study because I think many of you have heard about it. If you haven't, go visit. It is one of the best examples in the country of equitable TOD, and it's right at Seattle's Beacon Hill Light Rail stop. Also many years in the making. And is there a way that we can reach these equitable outcomes while achieving the urgency that our multiple crises in public health, in climate change, in our economy, and in racial inequity currently, we don't have the time to do it 12 years every project. So how do we achieve these outcomes? How do we learn to move faster? So I'll leave it there with those kind of big questions, and we welcome any questions you may have, and we'll look to the chat, and I'll hand it to Patience to bring us into the Q&A.
Thank you, James. And I believe there is a comment here, particularly on the ACDC's work and ability to do the project that you gave as a case study, really being supported by the aggressive inclusionary zoning program in Boston, and a lot of community action, and a lot of the integration of that community action into the planning process as well. So I think that's a comment that is really in order.
It is, yeah. So this is the risk of doing case studies, particularly when I can't see the audience. I thought if I chose far enough away, I wouldn't stumble into people who really know the deals, but Ken clearly knows the history of this deal. And it is very true. Part of what made that linkage work is a really aggressive inclusionary policy that is really the impetus between a lot of joint ventures, for-profit and affordable housing joint ventures there, that doesn't have an exact analog in many of our cities in Washington, but is worth thinking about how that plays. And the key point of the community really investing in planning, that is how it happened. That's how that site was given back to the community. The DOT would not have liked to give that site away that way, but for the planning and politics. And I think we have great examples of that locally. And I think that we are very lucky that we have some good transit agencies who really do want to partner with community here and are willing to work with us.
That is really true. And I think to the critical questions that you raise, we are very lucky as a region to have these transit agencies that are on the forefront of leading, with Sound Transit having the 80-80-80 rule, with King County Metro working on their own ETOD policy as well. So we do have some kind of work that is already in progress. And I think the bigger questions remain, as you raised. How do we do this in true partnership with the communities that are most impacted? How do we do this as affordable housing developers in partnership with communities? What do those joint ventures look like? Is there capacity building infrastructure that is put in place? Do we have the funding that enables that capacity building? Do we have activation grants to support the aggressive community action that was mentioned just now in this comment, as was seen in the ACDC's work? So I think we are close to time. James, if you want to close with any words at this point, this would be a great chance. And if there are more questions, feel free. We do have someone who's helping us with posting questions. If there are more questions, we'll answer those. But I will defer to you, James, to close the session.
Sure, thank you, Patience. And thank you for inviting me to take part. This has been a fun morning. Even though I can't see any audience feedback, my jokes may have landed with a silent thud. We have a wonderful community trying to figure this out in our state and in very different places. We see many of you, we learn from many of you, so thank you for listening in today. And this is obviously a continuing conversation. You know where to find us. We'll be seeing you. I would really love to delve deeper into some of these issues. And if you see things that are hard to figure out, if you see visions that don't feel like they have a feasible path, I think that's where we come in. We like the hard questions. We like the hard problems. We like to figure out how to create these partnerships across organizations, across sectors, and would love to be your partner in your communities figuring this out.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us.